Welcome everybody, welcome to Cyber Salon. I'm Eva Pasco, I'm the chair and co-host for tonight. Cyber Salon is a digital think tank. We're campaigning for better digital rights for all, less surveillance, and hopefully better digital futures for everyone. So today's session is episode 3 of our horizon scanning events. We've done one on health, we've done one on high street, and today it's about future communities. So obviously things have changed. We have all moved to work from home or hybrid work. So we posted questions to wonderful sci-fi writers to see what they think and how can reimagine our future community life. And hopefully today's session will bring some of the answers. So I just need to say the session is sponsored by Hydro 66, green data center based in Sweden, and Patchworks, data integrator, cloud integrator. As we know, cloud makes it all possible. So thank you, cloud. So just to move on to the next stage, I would like to do a little poll and ask you a question just to get the baseline. How do you currently participate in your communities? So is it primarily online, primarily offline, hybrid, or in solitude? As little people as possible. Because we know not everybody is into people. We can end the poll and share the results with everybody. Right, so hybrid is the name of the game probably, which is a challenge that we shall explore today. What does it mean if we are less together? What forces are driving us? Centripetal, centrifugal? Are we going to all go fake? So these are the questions for the panel, for the writers, and for the wonderful experts tonight. So if I can hand over to Ben, he will be chairing the session and he'll be introducing the experts and the writers.
So as I said, tonight is event 3 in the 4-part series Tales from the Cyber Salon, and this event focuses on a sense of community. I'm really glad to be able to welcome back Professor Rachael Armstrong to the panel for tonight's event, as well as Yen Oi and Edward Saperia. Some of these people you may recognize, some of these people may be new to you, but they have all joined us as part of the panel for this program for tonight. They've helped to contribute some of the original source materials for the writing open call, which began, oh gosh, 2 and a bit more months ago now, actually. So we, on the Cyber Salon site, we gathered some starting materials and made an open call for writers, of which the 3 gathered, as Stephen is an overlap again. Stories came in, we received slightly more than a dozen again, which was lovely. Whittled them down, sort of got our shortlist, and then put the shortlisted writers together with our panelists about 3 weeks ago, I think it was, 3, maybe 4 weeks ago now. We all sat down and we sort of explored some of the topics that were being raised. It's a chance to sort of work out and develop some of those ideas, certainly in terms of how we'll approach it this evening. Some of those extended the stories, stretched them a little, challenged both the writers and the experts for this evening, and hopefully made a better night of it tonight as we present them all to you. So I'm very glad to introduce our panel. If they all say hello and welcome themselves. So Rachael, if you'd like to say hello.
Hello everyone, I'm a Professor of Experimental Architecture at Newcastle University, and this is my second time on the Cyber Salon too, and I'm really excited about this evening's stories. They've all been absolutely thrilling.
Thank you, Rachael. Yen, hello and welcome.
Thank you, Ben. Hi, I'm Yen. I'm a writer, researcher. I write non-fiction, fiction, poetry, and computer games. And I love science fiction, which is kind of why I'm here, I guess. My research area is in Chinese science fiction, but I'm looking more at science fiction and how culture and identity can kind of come into play and work with the genre itself. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you, Yen. And Ed, people from Cyber Salon may already know before, but first time to the Tales from Cyber Salon series. Welcome, Ed.
Hi, everyone. My name is Edward Saperia. I run an organization called Newspeak House, which is the main hub for civic and political technology in London. and I think about how public sector and civil society organizations use technology, and in particular how sort of community organizations organize.
Wonderful, thank you, Ed. So a vast degree of expertise covering a vast range of communities and how they're assembled and what uses they might be put to here for tonight. And before we kick off our stories, I'd like to ask our second poll, which may or may not be teasing some of the themes that we're exploring in these tales. And that poll, if I put it on the screen now, who might you be willing to share personal data with to facilitate greater community? Your local council, your work's HR department, perhaps your local GP, or peer-to-peer direct matching, individuals only. Where are we on this one? Before the stories head. And there we go. So, we have some interest in our local council being involved in our communities for us. Little interest, although not much, with our GP being involved. Nobody wants a works event to be anything to do with their personal life, from what I can tell. But yes, there's this something about this peer-to-peer direct matching sounds interesting. Is there some AI behind peer-to-peer matching? How is all that going to work? Ooh, who knows? So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Stephen Oram to take us through the stories for this evening. Stephen.
Hello, everyone. So I'm, as Ben was sort of hinting at earlier, I'm the sort of resident author that's been across these events and co-hosting with Ben. A couple of things to say before I introduce the first story. They're about 5 to 6 minutes long. So the first story we're going to hear this evening is called Accept All Cookies. And this is Liam Hogan's story. So I'm going to pass over to Liam to read his story. We're all going to come off camera so we don't distract you too much whilst Liam's reading. So over to you, Liam.
Hi there. So this is Accept All Cookies. Elaine's finger hovered over the green button. She'd always been data wary, part of a generation who went through tediously unclicking sections rather than blindly accepting all. Until an AI agent remembered her preferences and managed that for her. But it seemed there was little you could do nowadays without sharing your information, your location, your every desire. Around her, boxes awaited their unpacking. This was a new beginning, a new life, a semi-retirement, working from her new town home rather than a city office, where most of the interactions were online anyway. Moving out from the big bad for a little more space and a lot less pressure. Or so the theory went. The button would hook her into the community net, an all-consuming AI that knew what you owned, what you bought, what problems you had, what skills, and then joined the dots. Opting out would mean she would be outside of that, would be as lonely as she had been in the city. Time to be brave. Time for a fresh start. Her doorbell went half an hour later, echoed by a buzz from her watch. A woman stood on the step, a plate held in front of her. "Hello, neighbour," she said brightly. "I made cookies. No nuts. I know you're allergic." Wow, that's... Elaine struggled for a moment. Homemade. Handmade. Would they be sanitary? She was up to date with her jabs, but still, it was tempting fate, wasn't it? The woman, whose name was Jill, chatted on for 10 exhausting minutes about the area, places to go walking, or shopping, or drinking, all while Elaine wondered if she should be inviting her in to the mess. "But I must let you get on," Jill said. "Don't worry about the plate. Return it when you're settled. Oh, nearly forgot. I'm at 42 with my brood. Elaine was surprised. 42 was halfway down the street, a rather distant neighbour. But that was the thing about net communities. With an AI to manage the introductions, they didn't need to be so geographically constrained. When the gazebo in the garden turned out to be rotten, Mark, from halfway across town, turned up with his chainsaw and stayed to help with the job of dismantling the wooden structure. Possibly to make sure the chainsaw wasn't returned blood splattered, though it had proved remarkably easy and fun to use. All from a throwaway comment on the community page. And when Elaine needed a plumber, recommendations flew in, making the search so much easier. Someone even swung by and picked up all her empty packing boxes, neatly sidestepping that particular chore. All very useful, though it felt a little one way. Jill, who had become a regular visitor, so much so that Elaine updated her calendar to indicate when she was supposed to be working, pointed out that was to be expected when somebody new moved in. It took a while to fully integrate. The community AIs had started as a tool insurers use to lower risk by sharing feeds from door cams and watching out for any unusual activity. They'd been co-opted by councils as a way of becoming greener, of reducing waste. Retail businesses had hated them at first. It meant they sold only the one chainsaw instead of a half dozen that sat unused 99% of the time. And there had been scandals early on over who had access to the data and who could tweak the feed. But over time, it morphed into something more organic, and businesses as well as users had adjusted. To Elaine, it looked like a messenger board, and you didn't see the sophisticated filters that kept it sane and relevant. When the AI itself reached out, it was always as a gentle prod, a DM with a suggestion or a no-pressure request. As autumn arrived, Elaine joined a host of her neighbours to pick and share apples and other local crops, and often as not, returned home to find some fresh produce on her doorstep. After an online chat with the horticulturists in the area, she ordered a heritage variety plum tree to sit where the gazebo had once been, an investment in the future. Christmas, never usually her favourite time of year, was made tolerable by wassailing in the community orchard, by the nods of recognition from neighbours who had become friends, by shared recipes and shared results, by a waifs and strays Boxing Day dinner, a gaggle of good-natured singletons that had led to a half dozen new friends, and one or two date requests for the new year. The local school, also part of the net, offered yoga and other exercise classes in the evenings for a nominal fee, far cheaper than the expensive city gyms she'd never really enjoyed or had time for. Art classes and language classes as well, something to consider for the future. Elaine volunteered to help out once a month at the reuse centre. The council provided containers full of things people no longer wanted, but other people might. Her job was to tag the contents for the net, each rehoming counting towards the council's ambitious recycling targets. She picked up a sturdy bicycle for herself and registered her electric car on the local pool. She wasn't displeased that others used it more often than she did. Slowly, her life expanded to fill the gaps that perhaps had always been there, hidden behind the hours she'd used to work and her addiction to box sets and Pinot Grigio. Then, almost a year after she'd moved in, she got a DM from the AI. She went to her window, peered down the street, and clocked the removals van. "Hello, neighbour," Elaine said brightly an hour later, stood on the doorstep under the quizzical gaze of the newest resident and net member. "I made cookies. Gluten-free."
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Liam. I personally, I always appreciate a clever title as well. So, accept all cookies. Thank you for that. And some comments in the chat. That's great. So our second of the 4 stories of the evening, we're going to move over to Jessie Rachael with the Valence program. So over to you, Jessie. And once again, just to remind people, pay attention.
Thank you. The Valence program. Shale oil extraction below the Sangre de Cristo Mountains unearthed imaginary people in July 2069. People preserved on paper, mostly villains that never existed. Details of their lives spanned decades in the documents hidden under Valens, an isolated community that had been led by Murphy Vega in the 1960s. For what purpose did he bury his creations, the painted portraits and doctored photographs of a non-existent population? The Valens program rose to prominence, claiming to have stabilized several small nation states facing crises a century later. Filing for IPO in 2075, founder Trip Stavely never referred to the historic community that shared his trademark, but he has relied on a similar strategy of manufacturing deviance for a targeted audience. Valens' inauspicious beginnings and current success is a cautionary tale as to what could become of our shared reality. Valens' mission statement, "Strengthen to Stabilize," originated from Stavely's time spent in isolation. An unknown illness banished him from his boarding school to his father's New Hampshire estate, where he watched Cottontail eat clover outside his bedroom window, as he endured years of physical therapy. The idea of incremental improvement through exacting process came to him as he relearned how to walk and mastered archery. After recovering from his illness, he used a recurve bow to kill most of the rabbits around his father's estate. Like all technology startups in the 21st century, family money buoyed Tripp's ambitions as he sustained large revenue losses. It wasn't until the antitrust breakup of social media companies that Valens turned profitable, taking over government contracts for countries on the verge of collapse. Stavely remained reticent on his initial success, but much of the credit can be attributed to his AI-constructed deviance. Referred to internally as the Lotus server, a reference to the lotus eaters in Greek mythology, the company created deepfake deviants with family histories and years of social media postings, photos, and videos for communities to examine and vilify. The ghosts that the Lotus server wove into the fabric of society became so effective as to become hyper-real. People claim to have known the deepfakes at some point in their lives, gone to school or worked with them, and above all, hated them. Murphy Vega had described it a century earlier as hijacking community malice and redirecting it toward ghosts. To assuage discontent in the Valens community in 1962, he deployed his own primitive version of a deepfake after several children contracted plague from prairie dogs. He directed the community's ire toward a migrant worker who did not exist, but whom the community blamed for the outbreak and burned in effigy after viewing photographs Vega had altered and after hearing deceptively edited recordings. Stability followed the banishment of the imaginary migrant, and he became part of the community's lore. People are primed to accept deepfakes, Stavely noted in his research, when the campaign aligns to their worldview, political ideologies, or base desires. The Lotus server aggregates data from consumer behavior and internet history to craft a shared valent event that plays on the fallibility of an individual's memories and a community's collective memory. Stavely described it as somebody yelling into a crowd, "Hey, you should all hate that thing over there, okay? Good, now we'll take care of it for you." Spark outrage, offer resolution, and reconcile cognitive dissonance. Guide an entire community back to health. Take the curious example of the Birchbower incident, named after the clandestine location where lobbyists for the mortuary industry met. A forest of white bark, pockmarked with black eyes staring out in all directions. In numerous leaked videos, the lobbyists discussed dismantling public health mandates during the 2081 pox pandemic to profit their clients. Roundly condemned by politicians in both parties, legislation quickly passed to increase health measures, saving countless lives, and the lobbyists were publicly shamed. Debate continues to this day if the lobbyists were creations of the Lotus server or real people, as some have claimed to have known them or be acquainted with distant members of their family. Stavely has pushed back at the criticism leveled at his company for creating alternate realities, saying, "Who wants a return to illness?" Accomplishing peace in the present by distorting the past justifies the Valens program, he has asserted, and that communities escaping poverty and violence would agree with him. Stavely has maintained that creating fictitious deviants guarantees that no real people get hurt, and that the Lotus server is such a small part of the Valens portfolio of business as to not warrant further scrutiny. All forms of disinformation require scrutiny, academics and researchers counter, even if deployed with altruistic intent. The AI-generated deviants cannot be created devoid of identifiable characteristics like ethnicity, religion, and culture, which has resulted in hate crimes directed at other communities based on the perceived origins of the deviant. When the success of a community is measured by its shared experiences and the open exchange of ideas, then gaslighting and lies become uncontrollable vectors that impede community progress. Murphy Vega tried to bury his creations under shale and sandstone. The community he once led now lies in ruins, a ghost town of broken boards and wall insulation made of newspaper, flaking off like yellow leaves in an autumn wind. The imaginary people he sought to hide from the world live on as objects of derision in a failed social experiment. Trip Stavely, who has ushered us into the new Valens era, would be wise to learn from the lessons of history. That is, if he can find a history that has not yet been altered. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much, Jesse. There's so much to say about that story. A very trite thing for me is I kind of hope some of my school friends are deep fakes because I think it might improve my memories of being at school. But I'm going to hand over to Rachael Armstrong now. Just Rachael, do you want to give us just some sort of initial moments of reflection on those two stories before we move on to the other two?
Yes, well, I mean, I must say, both of those stories really deeply haunt me. And there are quite a few resonances that really strike me. I think, first of all, they both feel like I'm deep in the matrix and everybody's taking blue pills. There is something unsettling about the concordance and kind of general acceptance of harmony, this kind of, quiet, happy, comfortable life. It really makes me want to, run around shouting, do something, unpredictable, like in Accept All Cookies, there's this stifling, Stepford Wives, like neighborhood, except it's AI, and there's this kind of weird notion of premonitions that your neighbors know what you want before you do. I find that incredibly intrusive, and it horrifies me that the protagonist is, kind of like adapts. And the same with the second story about the valence program. And this kind of stifling, it's easier to adapt than resist even the most brutal diet. You know, it's you know, this idea that you know, the faked world. I love this phrase, which is the cognitive dissonance and guiding an entire community back to hell. And I think the thing that I'm left with really is how much discomfort makes reality really real.
That's quite a good one, actually. I like that. Okay, so as idyllic as our communities might be, or we might want them to be, something discordant, something awkward and uncomfortable is going to keep it real. Before we jump into the second half, I'd like to throw up another poll, perhaps again setting some boundary conditions or initial conditions for the second set of stories. So here we go, very quick to participate in. Do you believe that local community is worth national investment? And so we have some options here. We are citizens of the world / cryptocurrency needs no, oh, I can't even read that, what does that say? Needs no state, so no. So that would be the absolutely not sort of option. You can opt out of investing in things because you don't think things should be invested in, or you don't think local is a measure of community. So that's option one. Option two, I care if my street is safe and rubbish is collected. So yes, invest for basic needs. I don't really use local services and work long hours, but a vibrant high street is a nice treat. So yes for quick treats, please, or quality of life. And then none of us are islands. A sense of community needs maintenance, just like roads. So yes for mental health. It seems to be a strong winner in our reason for community. How interesting. Lovely, thank you very much. Stephen, would you like to introduce
yes.
part two?
Sorry, I was too busy there looking at the poll results. Forgot what I was doing. Yeah, so we're now into the second half of the stories. Just to remind everybody, if anybody who's joined late, it's really worth just concentrating for this next 5 or 6 minutes, as Wendy Grossman is going to read us her story, Disconnect. So over to you, Wendy.
Disconnect. What are you doing? I need a new community, I said, and then wished I hadn't. What? Like a self-help group? I love my cousin Celia, really I do, but she has no idea how little she knows. No, it's my street. Huh? I had just discovered that my northern cousin Celia was so lost in the sophistication of Southwest London that it took me 3 hours to get her home from IBM Euston. She was so helpless. She had no idea how to integrate routes across neighborhood apps, and our local cash conversions completely defeated her. Apparently, Fleetwood is still using British pounds, and they pay with some kind of ancient tapping ritual. Have her to visit, my Aunt Marion had urged. She never goes anywhere. She used to be so brilliant, but since the pandemic, she just lives in that pub. So now she was here and fiddling with a laptop. You mean you're in a GOIRA, she said. Yes. Well, that's dumb. See? Total ignorance. The Communities' Rights Act passed in 2027. It strengthens communities. It's what the government said at the time, that communities proved their importance during the pandemic. And it allows us to be self-determining by bonding together in independent registered associations, IRAs. The Act creates 3 community types: geographical, local interest, and virtual. Geographical IRAs, GOIRAs, can opt out of council services and negotiate our own contracts for waste, recycling, and street cleaning, negotiate collectively for electricity, water, and gas, exploit naming rights, and exercise the right to inclusion. That one's really important, so new members share the IRA's values. Our small cul-de-sac of 20 homes quickly voted to become a GOIRA. We then contracted with the company that owns all our freeholds for what used to be council services, and the freehold subcontracted to the council anything it couldn't make profitable, home care, for example. Waste pickup is more efficient, And ending the council's townscape classification lets the north side houses install awnings in front, so their houses are cooler in summer. The council is still a problem. It's prosecuting us over the awnings. Celia interrupted. Hey, this map says your street name is Barclays North Avenue. That's not the address you gave me. Oh, the council screwed us, I said. Naming rights became a thing. My street accepted a small stipend to add Barclays to our post office street name. It only lasted a couple of months until Barclays decided we don't generate enough data and pulled out, complaining we didn't have a CCTV camera. That's the council. Celia was at the window. Doesn't the video billboard drive you nuts? I'm hoping a new IRA will get rid of it, I said, staying focused on my screen. My personal data store didn't support any of the apps I was using, so I had to copy and paste. IRAs began commercializing in 2031. The Southwest London Association leased our street from the freeholder, and like a lot of them, began requiring us to share all their data. Now these associations are consolidating, so you don't always know where you'll end up. I was juggling 5 different calculations: each community's features, my acceptability, compatibility of values, projections of each community's business model and possible future ownership, and an analysis of conflicts with my 5 other IRAs, 2 local interests, 3 virtual. I'm not finding much, I said. I think my social score is screwing me up. What is it? In 2028, the CRA was amended to require communities to know your members to eliminate fraud, I said. Most IRAs outsource this to the banks and the 3 big credit scoring services, Equifax, Experian, and Facebook, which bought TransUnion in 2026. I have to submit a verified social score. You're like Aunt Marion, still thinks I'm a barmaid. I meant, what is your social score? Oh, 436, I said. She looked shocked. Look, they take off points for sleeping late, and I belong to this virtual IRA about the future of technology that they think is weird. And last year I only got 3 out of 10 on a pop quiz on my neighbors' middle names. Stop laughing. She looked down at her laptop and tapped a few keys. If you're not a barmaid, what are you? I work for Commugent. The pub rents offices with terabit broadband. My glasses crashed. Hang on. Please, please. Okay, I'd only lost the last few fields. I just need to concentrate for a minute. Celia was muttering something, but I tuned her out. Suddenly, she plonked her antiquated laptop on my lap. There'll be a code in your email from admin. Type it in here. I was glad my friends couldn't see. My screen full of accounts and calculators appeared on Celia's screen in a single view I'd never seen before. She pushed a button to project it on the ceiling. My social score now read 700. Did you do that? I work for Commugent. I write this shit. What is Commugent? The fast-growing world leader in community management systems? I still didn't get it. This is good, actually. I never get to talk to real users. She stared at the display and then shook her head. Rejoin the council. The council is for rejects. My side of the street is going TikTok. I want not them. Celia sighed. How do people live in London? It's so far from everything, and it's so pointlessly complicated. The Fleetwood Council was so right. I had read about this. Regressive northern councils called the act a project to undermine local authorities. When it passed, they put non-compete clauses in their supplier contracts. The 3 biggest geo-operators, TikTok, Weatherspoons, and QAnon Holdings, have referred them to the competition authorities. The case is stuck in the judicial system with our awnings. The act will come for you too, I said. Eventually.
That's wonderful, Wendy. Thank you very much. We were saying, so making sure we could have some kind of visible display of the humor and entertainment value of that story. But I mean, it's readily apparent. Thank you very much. So it falls on me to introduce the reader of our 4th and final story for tonight, which is Stephen Oram. Stephen, will be reading his story, Gathering Power. I'll pop the link to it into the chat now, and Stephen, take it away.
Thanks, Ben. So, Gathering Power. Her cluster of friends had been hushed. Her connection implants dialed down as close to zero as possible. Her panel displays blurred. She glanced at the fridge, switched off in her determination to avoid an accidental alert to anyone outside of her home. She relished the isolation stretching out in front of her, and yet at the same time she longed for someone to break her veneer of solitary contentment. She wanted to be alone, and she wanted to be wanted. What someone had once inaccurately nicknamed Schrodinger's friends. She sat on her bed, flicking her head in rhythmic jerks, moving from one pointless piece of clickbait to the next. And yet, despite the attempt to keep the darkness at bay, a crippling apathy for life enfolded her. She had a niggling feeling that something was wrong with her cluster buddy, Jamie, but she pushed it to the back of her mind. She winked, she smiled, and she blew kisses to comments from the online acquaintances she stumbled across in her wanderings. Gestures as pointless as the posts they praised. There was an irritating thump, thump, thump in the hallway. She wandered to the front door and turned the full-length panel to its viewing setting. Next door's kids were busy bouncing a ball against the wall. They waved. She switched the panel to one way and watched them for ages, until she got worried that they would start to appear on her day-to-day connections as proximities, mixed in with her chosen cluster. It was for that very reason that she avoided too much flesh contact with anyone. Each one of the implants scattered across her body represented a friend, a member of her cluster. A cluster initially drawn together around a shared obsession with the obscure art movement vorticism. She knew who was who from the implant's location and vaguely knew how they were feeling from the pattern of its vibrations. There was a beautiful harmony of frustration and comfort in being constantly aware that they were out there living their lives. The implant that connected to Jamie was still worrying her. He was the only one of her cluster who lived close by and the only one she had flesh met, and he was struggling with something, but she couldn't summon the energy to find out what was wrong. It was selfish, she knew that. It was also about protecting herself from being swamped by whatever he had going on. Back in her room, she sat and listened to the kids playing in the background. Now she knew what it was. The steady thump of their ball was comforting, and their occasional laughter made her smile. She felt more in tune with the world, and when Jamie's distress increased another notch, she dialed her panels up to full. He appeared on the nearby street, where the windows of the shop selling repurposed tech doubled up as panels. Naked from the waist up, he was swaggering along, unashamedly showing off his implants for anyone to see. God, he was sexy. It was brave, it was stupid, and it was typical of Jamie. Not the first time, and as ever, likely to attract the wrong sort of attention. The display crystallized into a scene created from some of those in her cluster. She loved how it pieced together someone in their kitchen, someone in the street, someone on a train, and so on, all into a collage that made it look as if they were all in the same space. 10 of her 50-strong cluster were waving and shouting greetings. Jamie's distress, or was it excitement, increased again. What's happening with Jamie? She asked, hoping it wasn't another system glitch her body would misread and react to in some unnecessary way. She could do without that. They ignored her, instead asking how she was and noting that she'd been absent for a while. Some sent probing messages directly to her earbud asking how she really was and why her vitals were so off, especially her gut bacteria. She told them not to worry and that she had been getting some alone time, to which they responded with messages of empathy, tinged with concern. She was pleased. It was nice to see them again, and soothing to be reminded that they cared. She decided that Jamie's distress was most likely a sign of the adrenaline pumping around his body, and relaxed into watching his promenade and waiting for the inevitable. Sure enough, a bunch of anti-cluster thugs appeared and surrounded him, threatening him with scalpels and offering to relieve him of his weirdo implants. He was grinning while dodging from side to side, and each time he came into view, he yelled for help. Shit, why does he do this? She muttered. Call the police, she shouted. Her friend Tilly shouted back, done. She screamed at the thugs, leave him alone. Using the panel's latest feature, she told it to face recognize them, and within seconds it had displayed their names and addresses. Look, you stupid idiots, she shouted. Look at the panel. We know who you are. Piss off or we'll find you. And the thugs stopped and stared at the 10 faces hurling abuse at them. They turned to each other, hesitated, and then ran away shouting obscenities over their shoulders. She was exhausted. Back in bed with her panels blurred, she connected directly with a few friends and just chatted. After a few reassuring bouts of banter, she felt better, and propping herself up with her pillows, she set her panels to a half setting and relaxed. A day of having her cluster nearby without having to interact was what she had wanted, and most likely what she had needed all along. The doorbell rang. She pulled herself out of bed and ambled to the door. Jamie was there, topless, with his big grin and a takeaway. She chuckled. He certainly knew how to press her buttons. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, grand. And if I can, Yen, are you there? Would you please offer some initial thoughts on those last two stories that we've heard?
Sure. Thank you for all the stories today, and they've been really, really amazing. And I just wanted to start by saying that I think we should all remember that short stories are, even though my favorite medium, a really difficult medium to write with so much information in them. And I think all the stories have done really well in terms of picking something that they wanted to get their teeth into and just really kind of getting the point across in these stories. And I think for both Disconnect and for Gathering Power, I wrote a few words down as notes to kind of remind myself of what I wanted to say, and I'll just read these words out. It's three things. One is distraction. The second thing is the appearance of choice or control. And the third is intrusion or intrusivity in our lives. And I find it really interesting that both kind of show a world where we're living full of distraction. I mean, I can't actually imagine how people in both these worlds work, like how they can sit down and concentrate on a task like sending someone an email or project managing, something that's quite mundane, because it's so full of energy and around things that feel a little bit useless around us, which is really interesting because it does feel like we're actually going into that place, in today's time and today's technology. And the appearance of control or choice, I think, is really interesting because, as much as in Wendy's story, the protagonist thinks that she knows everything, and then, Celia comes in and swoops in and actually says, do you know what, I know better than you, kind of thing. The idea that the protagonist thought she was in control, but actually all that knowledge that she gained, through the history of the developments of these RRAs and, all these kind of stuff, just feel like it's a huge burden on her to figure out how to survive in this society rather than help alleviate any of the problems that they were set out to alleviate in the first place. In the same way with Stephen's story, where all the implants and stuff are there to create sort of flexibility in your social communities and to give you the control over who you want to connect with or who you don't, who you want to keep close. But at the end of the day, you know, the idea that you can switch off or switch on and do all that is some sort of an illusion, because you're actually just forced to keep at it. Like, you know, she doesn't spend too long actually dialing down to nearly nothing. She gets so distracted, she pushes it up again, you know, and that constant fiddling makes you feel like you're in control, but actually the system's overrun with with distractions and with the idea of choice for you, and everything is intruding into the lives of both stories. So I thought, you know, that was really interesting, and I want to kind of leave with a little question, I guess, for everyone to think about. Actually, in both these worlds, what do you think would happen at Christmas time or at Valentine's? I would love to read a story, you know, set in the same worlds, but just around a Christmas dinner, for example. I think that would be really amazing. You're muted, Ben.
I got you. Thank you. That's fantastic. Thanks, Jan. We're going to have to now add additional commissions to the book to be able to cover these new exciting writing prompts. But yeah, thank you very much. And I think maybe one way to start sort of unpicking some of what we've seen from the, you know, utopic, dystopic, the range of both between that we've heard so far tonight. Ed, if perhaps I can turn to you. When we set up the event, we really started to see it in light of COVID stories around community. You know, almost as if community was something that we'd newly discovered as a nation in the last 18 months, you know, in a support service or something like that. But I mean, nobody would want to have to go through, you know, that loss of 100,000 plus lives again to establish community. Maybe are there things that we've, you know, are there tools that we've seen in these stories tonight, or techniques that we've seen in these stories tonight that you think we'll need to maintain community moving forward? You know, or do we just get it now and community is something we got? Yeah, where would you see yourself as we go through this?
Oh, I think that's a very, I mean, you know, for me, I think somehow, you know, it's been amazing. I mean, obviously, you know, some of these stories are sort of designed to be speculative, but you know, a lot of maybe sort of what people are talking about is kind of stuff that's sort of happening now in a way, or at least yeah, you know, we're like maybe scaling up things that are happening at the moment, or sort of you know, dramatizing. And you know, overall, I think the pandemic has been disastrous for communities. Really, you know, obviously, like this event as an example, you know, we are exploring different ways of sort of let's say building relationships. My first thought for all of these stories and this kind of discussion in general is somehow how nice everyone is all the time. I think, like, you know, the thing that we've really seen that sort of marks our communities is like conflict, and conflict for all kinds of reasons. And that's sort of a big, you know, sort of a big driver of this kind of community. I think it's you know, another really clear driver is kind of like parasociality, and so people building, you know, working to build their profiles and sort of grow followings. You know, I think a lot of the kind of online community activity we see is sort of in the context of some kind of famous figure or some kind of like, you know, someone who's sort of content creation publisher kind of thing, and often quite divisive. You know, maybe a smaller community is, oh, you know, there's sort of one cab driver for the town or something like that. Right. And we all kind of know this, you know, we know Steve the cab driver. And it may be that actually somehow, you know, we can sort of develop a much more sort of sophisticated kind of niche economy around different things like that. And that can be a way of kind of discovering our ties with other people, where, you know, where just simply like coexisting maybe becomes a bit less tangible.
So we've got the support ideal in place. We may have got the self-help or some of the self-help ideals in place in the stories tonight. But almost as Rachel was saying this morning, there's, you know, we're sort of missing out on that kind of nasty, spiky human-to-human interaction that no one's bothered to engineer into these platforms. I wonder why. I'd like to bring out the commerce, versus community caring sort of story, because I know it got us quite far before. Yen, can I turn to you on that one and saying, so Ed's saying, yes, on one side you can say we've got an evolution of community where it was person-to-person profiles, then local businesses and recommend a plumber, and commercial interests come in and start to help develop these tools. Would you care to comment on that path of evolution to community?
I think it's really interesting using the pandemic, just because physically the pandemic separated us, being isolated, having to kind of self-isolate, self-quarantine and all that kind of stuff. But it created a space online that forced us to kind of come together. So in some ways it killed the community, and in some ways it built the community. And I think what's important is for us to kind of consider what we want from the community and how communities can actually positively help the development of politics, of ecology, of commerce, even around us. One of the thoughts that I had whilst listening to all the stories before was the idea that in ecology or in sort of eco-science, a lot of scientists talk about how a good community are the ones that kind of are very quick to kind of save themselves and the people within the community. So, if, say, you live near a volcano and the community is tight, if the volcano erupts, people know precisely which houses they need to run to save which people first, who are able to kind of help themselves and who are not able. Those kind of communities are really important. And I wonder, in a positive manner, if AI and if technology is used correctly or nicely or kindly, perhaps we can emulate that to create environments where if a pandemic hit again, what do we do straight away? And then, or if a natural disaster hit, what do we do straight away? There's some positive thinking there, but I can't exactly see how that might work, in a perfect way, if you see what I mean.
No, I do, but I certainly also picked up on the idea that, where a part of the narrative we've been in as a nation this last year is that crisis has created community. You're saying, well, actually, we've completely got the cart before the horse here. What we really, really needed was community, to begin with. And we would have had potentially far more resilience and survivability of crisis than had we done it the other way around. Perhaps a wake-up call. But I do know that, so Simon and I have been talking about community and established communities that we recognize. And as you said, one of the problems we've had recently is the physical separation of person-to-person, in-person communities. So I know we want to talk about the way that we might have some examples of community in, say, gaming communities or other online communities. Simon, if this is a point at which you think those observations are relevant, then please bring those in as well.
Yeah, so one of the things that struck me sort of with this viewpoints as using video games as a sort of framing device is that they all had like a slightly different take on fragmentation. Most of them were quite optimistic, and Wendy's was pessimistic. So if we look at acceptable cookies, there's a fragmentation in there that we accept the local network to be separate from everything else, but that's self-sufficient. So we assume that the AI has a very good availability to all the data to kind of make these decisions. And I think within the context of a singular game where they deal with a lot of data, and they also care a lot about the social features because that's a big draw for video games and those kind of communities. That's definitely true. I think the problem is a little bit more of what if the relationships are a little bit more amorphous and you're not what if somebody moves on from a certain platform or a certain game, or maybe somebody misinterprets something, and that's sort of where we get into sort of the story of disconnect, right? Where your experience of living somewhere, or even maybe your experience as neighbors, could be completely different depending on all the different intersections of your community that you have. And this is certainly a really, really big problem. Within the gaming sphere, if you move on from one game to the next, or even you start to play different hours, or you do like you're part of a different team, there's really not a lot of like organic substance there to kind of migrate you from one to another, mostly because of yeah, really weird, well, I mean, like really obvious financial incentives. Like nobody wants to play together because there's really no obvious money to be made. We can see that Stephen's story is like a very positive take on that. Like, what if your community could actually interject in the physical community in a way that's seamless and can really protect you? And that would be super interesting because, you know, it's pretty well known that pretty gnarly side of games that there's a lot of abuse, a lot of racist abuse, a lot of sexist abuse. And it's fundamentally very invisible because it kind of sits in the very opaque layer of interaction within the video game itself. There's often some kind of recourse mechanism, but there's not really great visibility. And it's because this kind of interaction is really difficult to store and to analyze and make public again because of this very large private influence. And that's where I thought Raoul's story about balance is interesting. I really like the tenet of this idea of fake identities, but I couldn't help but think, like, definitely in the future, because of the lack of data and because of like platforms die and nobody cares about persistence, this data will definitely be misconstrued. Because, you know, you see online communities die, you know, people turn the servers off, like that information gets lost. And again, companies would much rather sit on the IP than actually provide a transition for these social communities.
This is interesting. So we've kind of found ourselves, although we try pushing quite hard in the stories to talk about the individuals and the personalities and the characters that are inhabiting them, into a conversation about the tools here. So the tool chain of assembling community, the lifespan of that tool, the complexities of, say, you know, the algorithmic natures and the biases that that tool might bring in. And Ed, I see you commenting in the chat, and Wendy also starting to comment in the chat around, you know, one of the, I'm thinking, cheapest crossover options there might be, like your school's Fortnite group where they actually meet up in real life, for instance. There's definitely things to explore in the tool chain, how much agency we have over the tool chain. If for no other reason, then who pays for the tool chain? I mean, Epic can play Fortnite free for everybody forever, but if you want the kind of like police connected static devices in the street that you can shout to expose, you know, a robbery in progress or an assault in progress, as in Stephen's story, then that's a fairly expensive piece of, you know, city hardware. So who's paying for that? Taxes? So let me say, let's set the new question then. Which of the motivations, perhaps, in this evening's stories would be the strongest one upon which to build a case for financial investment in community? Is it about repurposing city space for town space in Liam's story, as we're helping people move into a better mental health space? I know, talking with Liam, part of that tale, the technology is there to help that person discover that better, healthier lifestyle, or is it protecting the inner city, as perhaps it is more in Stephen's? Who would like to sort of tackle on that? Who's trying to build communities in their community right now, and what's the case we can make for it? Ed, that sounds ideally up your street. Ed, do we have you?
Sorry, I'm thinking.
I've asked you too hard a question. Oh, I'm sorry.
While Ed is thinking, can I
Yes.
put two comments? So one thing, it's all about risk, and investment is really to mitigate that risk. And the risk is enormous. So one thing that reminded me, listening to the first story, there's a study by Professor William Hurst, who is based in New School in New York, about the 10-year recollection of events from 9/11 and now 20 years of 9/11. And the scary thing about it is that people who remembered correctly forgot what they remember, now remember something completely different. People who remembered incorrectly corrected it, but not necessarily in the right way. So basically our memory with physical events is really fallible. Our memory with virtual events is even worse. So, you know, we're very prone to fill in the gaps and remember what has never happened. And I think the online life, it really lends itself to being sucked into very deep negative vortex of fakeness. It's a really junk space. And let's face it, I founded the first internet cafe in the world, so I'm as guilty as anybody. But email relationships are fake and junky and shallow. And we just have to make sure everybody gets it, that there is nothing good, because the community does not scale online. And I think that's what Wendy explained to me a long time ago, because I was feeling, maybe we just haven't got the right tools. The community does not scale. When you watch this idiotic neighborhood apps that are trying to scale it, 20 people fine, 200 people maybe, 2,000 people, nobody knows what's going on anymore. You have to invest in less than Dunbar number. And I think Ed knows about that. 150 is really max. But my second question was cultural, really, and it's probably a question for Yen as well as Ed, and maybe Rachel, because you've done a lot of cross-cultural stuff. When you look at Japan, they have this concept of kikubari, where people just have high empathy and they second guess what you need. And it just is, it's in the culture. And when we had the business there, I always was quite freaked out how observant they are and how nice and second guessing they are what you need. But it's in a absolutely positive way. People are just sensitive to each other's needs. So some cultures are much more sensitive as a baseline and don't perceive that as invasive. And it's probably about functionality of that survival. So maybe Yen or Ed or Rachel can comment on that.
I'll just comment quickly about Japan, just because I lived there for 3 years, and I was very fortunate to actually have a very immersive cultural teaching and learning experience as well. It was all paid for by the company that moves us for my husband, etc., etc. So we got like a really deep immersive experience into the Japanese culture. And what you take as the empathy that they show is interesting, because the Japanese people see themselves as valley villages, and because the way the country is developed, all the big cities and towns are all in valleys. And when you're set out geographically in this kind of valleys, everyone in the town, and actually if someone stole something, exactly who did that. If someone murdered someone and ran off to the next town, exactly who did that, because everyone is accounted for. And with that, they have this really interesting way of kind of tiptoeing around each other, because you want to keep everyone happy. If your community's in each other's faces all the time, you have to keep each other happy. And I think that's a really important kind of thing to remember, is that the physical boundaries that we have creates a lot of cultural necessities. I actually found their tiptoeing very infuriating, because they will never tell you the truth of what they actually feel, because they don't want you to be embarrassed, and they don't want you to feel bad about yourself or about what's happening. And a small example would be, if you're standing on the escalators on the wrong side, if you turn behind you, there will be a long stream of people just standing there waiting. Whereas I know that if you're in London, you'll get someone right at the bottom going, "Oi, tourists, get out of the way." It's a very different environment, but I think it works in the London version, just because if you're impairing everyone else's movement, I think you need to be told. But at the same time, in Japan, no one will ever feel embarrassed, but they also have a very high sensitivity towards personal embarrassment. So if they made a mistake themselves, it becomes a really, really big deal. So like here, if I made a mistake and I stood on the wrong side, I'm fine. I just move away the next time. But there, it becomes a huge kind of impact on who I am, on how I've lost face, on how I've become this social, this horrible person in this social space, and everyone now knows that I'm the foreigner who doesn't know the rules, kind of thing. So there's a lot of implications that comes with this empathy, and I don't think one or the other is healthy. I think we need something in between.
Yes, I'd like to follow up on that. And I think my question was actually, well, my response is really about the people watching elements. So like if I sit in a cafe, I can quite happily get a sense of that physical relationship between people, culture, but also a kind of manners and an etiquette for being part of a community. And I learned that not by necessarily having a face-to-face conversation with someone like we're doing online. And I mean, like this Zoom format is like having endless meetings. You can never just chill out and go, oh, let's just see what everybody's doing. Or, you know, but you learn an awful lot about socialization from that quiet participation, non-participation, bodily cues, you know, kind of ineffable knowledge that you get from just being with, not necessarily explaining things through words or images. So there's a question for me which is coming with these online communities being forced together, and they're all having these great debates. You know, they're discussing whether it's one brand or another brand, or whether we're using the tools in one way or another way. And that kind of quiet space of just coexisting seems to be squeezed out, which is why my question about public space was raised. I think there are lots of different kinds of commons in the digital world, but it's the establishing, I think, as Ava was saying, meaningful relationships. It's not just always about winning an argument or having people click the same tick box as you. And I don't think that space has been designed into it. So I think it's a really good question about culture and these other aspects that have kind of grown up with people being together.
Would it be a less valid experience, the coffee shop people watching experience, if, you know, your smart glasses that you were wearing while sitting there was literally reading back like factual based evidence and information on everybody as it's recognizing them? So if you had one of Stephen's street information systems, or like tucked things up, you're not, did you learn it in the same way, or does it just feel like you've done like, you know, A-level revision notes on your community, and sort of like, you know, it is an exam, as Wendy's saying? Yes, you might score points for their middle names, but you know, do we have to actually, I guess I'm begging the question here, but actually inhabit our community to learn about it and to understand it?
All right, so I mean, I had a thought. I mean, you know, I think I've been coming at this from a very pessimistic view, and definitely like that's been a view. But you know, maybe another way to think about this is, obviously, you know, the internet has been a great source of value for lots of people. You know, I can go online and I can learn about anything, and I can go and talk to anyone, and I can go and, you know, listen to what 100 different professors have to say, and, you know, all of these things. And I can go and find, you know, enormous communities of tens of thousands of people who just like talking about the one thing that I like talking about. And I can go and talk to them 24 hours a day until I die, right? And, you know, with a little bit of patience, you can go and find, you know, the nichest community about the nichest thing, however you like, and you can go and find fan clubs for anything. And I think, you know, somehow an important context here is, without online you can't do that. Right? Of course, you know, so in some sense, like, it may just be that you know, somehow what we used to have is maybe a little bit disappointing, and sure, it doesn't allow you to have kind of you know, sort of maybe like multi-dimensional relationships in that kind of way. But I think in some sense we're also just spoiled, right? Somehow, you know, we expect things to be all the time, and we expect to really get the best in the world all the time. And now that we have that, and you know, the price we pay is, you know, you lose somehow, like this, you know, the fact that you're a human being in one location as like a source of value, right? But the upside is large, and I think you know, the internet is not going to give you anything but information goods, right? It's only going to give you words and pictures. Although, having said that, you know, there's also loads of places you go online and exchange gifts with people and get cards, and people can, you know, and people like raise money for all kinds of things, for serious things and for frivolous things, you know, from people they know and from people they don't know. And if you want to build, you know, and everyone around, and the reason why you get this is because everyone around you is trying to sort of like build a profile in their niche. And if you want to do the same, you can knock yourself out, and it costs nothing, and you can start today, right? And not only that, there's people who will work, who will help you, and there's lessons and, communities that will support each other in trying to do this. So it's not all bad. It just looks different.
That is a good point. We are thinking about it in the filter bubble of having had an online system wired up to everybody for nigh on 20 years now. Some of us 20 years worth of it, certainly the last decade or more of it. If all we're experiencing in our sense of loss of community is a readjustment, sort of a feeling of information overload swamped out by a year's worth of zero in-person meetings, then I might be quite happy for that. You're right, Ed. There's tremendous value in the networking purely digital. And maybe it's entirely the wrong tool to actually build a sense of community. I would like to reflect, since this began as a writer's night, and ask the writers, you've shared with us your stories, you've given us your content and your dreams and ideals of community, you've listened to the discussion, maybe we missed the point entirely. Is there something in your tale that you really, really wished we'd got and we didn't, or that you loved that we did got, or halfway between? Liam, I think I'll turn to you first, since your accept all cookies kicked us off for the night. How are we doing? What did you want to bring?
It's kind of interesting to me. I mean, it's been mentioned by some of the speakers. What is the financial incentive to create communities, especially if they're online? And I don't know that that's been answered tonight. It's been talked around and talked at a little bit. And maybe it's not obvious that there is a financial incentive, and that the financial incentives that currently exist may well be skewing the communities towards things which actually aren't that inclusive, aren't that welcoming. So I do wonder if there is a solution, what that would come as. And I've, for the sake of make-believe and creating the story, I've tried to suggest it might actually be the big mission that we're all going to be on of the next 10, 20 years, which is trying to get towards a more greener world, and whether that would push towards groups trying to be more efficient, because it's very difficult for one person to be efficient on their own. Because I like the idea of small communities that do work with 150 people or so, but how do we create them, and what are they actually linked by?
Yeah, I'd just like to add to that one of the things I took from your story was actually the opportunity to make part of tonight, rather than saying, what tool do I use to build community, but that community is a tool that builds other things in and itself. And so if you in this next 15, 20-year grand green project we're probably going to need to engage ourselves in, the community has tremendous value as a tool there. So thanks for sharing that with us, Liam. It's been great having you here. Jesse, can I turn to you for a similar piece? Are we on track? Are we getting something from the piece?
Yes, I think the discussion's been very valuable. What I was aiming to really dig into with my story is the proliferation of disinformation in communities, and is targeted at various communities, meant to divide communities, and really how that's impacting us currently, and what the future of that will look like potentially. We've already seen deep fakes that have been campaigned to various groups, countries, and fallen for a deep fake campaign myself. And so it was, I've been very pleased to see that the discussion that has come from these stories. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Care to share that anecdote? That's really quite interesting in itself, actually.
Sure. Well, is there anybody here that's part of the chess community? Play a lot of chess? Now, part of the holy grail of chess is having a self-moving chessboard that you can play with others on, they're in another country, and you have a chessboard in front of you. You make a piece move, it moves the board, the piece on their side of the world, and you play. And just having a beautiful chessboard that can do that quickly, accurately, a lot of tech companies have been striving to go for. About, I would say about 2 years ago, there was a company that looked legitimate and had beautiful videos and a board of developers and executives that had an amazing product and was requesting, of course, funds. And I fell for it immediately because my brain was primed for accepting this thing that I've always wanted, which is an amazing chessboard that could just move so crisply and cleanly. And luckily, there were a lot of smart people in Lichess and chess.com communities that saw it, could identify some artifacts in the videos and identify the people as this person doesn't exist that they had put up, and quickly called out that campaign. So it was a bit of a revelation, having fallen for a deep fake myself.
It's very interesting. In fact, crowdfunding, as Ed points out, that is one of the commercial communities that we didn't kind of get over. And I know there've been everything from the exception perhaps that people took to Facebook picking up Oculus from the gaming industry, when what felt like a community thing suddenly became a super corporate event, to, as you said, communities small and large being prey to fraudsters and victims of deceit on a commercial angle. That's worth picking as well. Writers, Wendy, did we find, have we been able to pick out some of your details?
I thought so. I mean, I wanted to say something about the Valens project, though. The thing that I really loved about it was the notion that they had figured out that the way to get communities to bond is to have an enemy. And if you didn't actually have an enemy, you had to create one. I thought that was quite brilliant. But, one of the things about the pandemic, which is kind of where this kind of originated, is that I was never so conscious of being privileged as during the last year and a half. And part of that is I actually really do live on a small cul-de-sac near Kew Gardens with 20 houses, and we all know each other, and because we meet in the street. And so when then the lockdown came, our worst month was the month that the shop around the corner was closed because one of them had COVID, and we were terribly worried about them. But also they're the people we really depend on. And so but my street, one of the things that we did, one of my neighbors said, let's all go out and sit in front of our houses every Saturday at 4. And we went and sat out in front of our houses every day, Saturday at 4, and shouted to each other across the street. And as part of that, everybody on the street started sitting in front of their houses at other times. And so it made the street was just weirdly, terribly social during the pandemic. And then as soon as the lockdown ended, everybody kind of went back to sitting in the backs in their backyards. But, and in the pre-discussion, it came up that a small village in Japan, or I actually don't remember which country it was, would have an official person whose job it was to know everything about people. Well, we have a volunteer for that job, and she does know everything about everybody. And she's always the one who's going around and fixing people's gardens. And, I found her this afternoon talking to my neighbor's parents who are visiting. and So, like I say, and the thing that did strike me is that if the government decided the community was something worth having, they would do it in this very synthetic way, and it would all be about knowing weird bits of information about your neighbors, as opposed to actually knowing them because you've brought them food or they've fixed your garden. So that was the whole thing.
Yeah, thanks, Wendy. I'm definitely tilting more towards the community as a tool and a resource to use. There's value in it for itself. It's not the end; it's the beginning. Sort of vibe of this. And Stephen, I hate to call you out, my friend, but I feel the need to do so in a similar way. But
I think for my particular story, the thing that I was sort of hovering around was this notion of accidental community. I don't know if you noticed, like the two emotional hooks are the kids, the next door's kids actually soften her up, and the guy in her cluster she's actually met and fancies and all the rest of it. The fact that she's actually met him is where that's where her emotions are sort of much more tangibly softened and touched. And I think that's sort of what I was trying to get around, this sort of sense of community. Is I guess what I would be not wanting is a future where you can control your community, where you can sort of dial out the stuff that you don't want, and you can sort of sterilize what happens to your life. Because
not wanting.
That's not what I want.
Yeah, there is a very human element in being a member of a community that in many ways I think we did manage to touch on tonight. Well, thank you. I mean, thank you very much, everybody. I think we've had another wonderful night in the series. Report on cybersalon.org, same as all the rest of our content, same as the stories. If you wish to review them, read them, share them again with other friends, and please do keep an eye open for the call for papers for event series 4, which I can tell you will be on monies and payments. So again, it just remains me to thank Professor Rachael Armstrong, Yen Oi, Ed, Saperia, and all our writers this evening, and of course Ava for hosting our event. And for our final words, Ava.
Just to thank you very much for submitting the fabulous stories, and for the experts to put time and passion to comment on them. It's been really fabulous, and I hope we can extract the best and share with people who do communities for a living. You know, a lot of our friends work in community building, online, offline, hybrid, and everybody's asking, what do I do? What's the best use of money? What's the biggest risk? What to avoid? So I think we'll have a few more of these conversations, but we'll share it widely with all the right people. So thank you very much.